Gang, you're going to love this one. Wait until you see what happens when an actual historian starts dropping truth bombs about reparations, slavery, and colonialism on woke students at Cambridge University. This is Rafe Haydo-Manku, a well-known historian and television commentator in Britain. And recently he did what many believe would be impossible. He left an audience of woke college students at the Cambridge Union absolutely stunned silent over historical facts regarding what really happened under British colonialism.
But, in recent months, we've seen the issue of slavery and colonialism expand beyond campuses, as we've now got, of course, from Barbados to Jamaica, prominent Caribbeans also calling for Britain to pay reparations for slavery and the consequences of colonialism. And, Madam Speaker, were we engaged in this debate in 1807 or 1833, I likely would have crossed the floor to support the motion opposite, because, of course, the victims of the horrendous horrors of slavery would have been alive and deserving of damages. But it's not 1807, it's not 1907, it's not even 2007. Over 2 centuries have passed since Britain led the world as the first empire in history to abolish slavery, and the right of reparations died long ago, because reparations are fundamentally about matters of tort law. The purposes of damages, restoration, of reparation, is to restore the victim, the slave, to the position they were in before the damage occurred, slavery. The actual victim only can receive damages, not their descendants. And therein lies the rub, because some 6 or 7 generations separate those alive today from their British Empire slave ancestors. And whilst not just yet, thank you so much. Whilst it's undeniable that 19th century slaves suffered unspeakable horrors, in what way can this lead one to conclude that their great-great-great-great-great-grandchildren are also victims and deserving of reparations too? On the contrary, from Britain to the Caribbean, the descendants of slaves today have a far better and higher quality of life than they would have had their ancestors remained in Africa. And that's an indisputable fact.
Now, I really liked how he framed the debate there. Reparations are inescapably a matter of tort law, and the purpose of tort law is to compensate individuals that suffer personal or property damage because of another's wrongful conduct. And the fundamental flaw in the reparations argument is that neither the victim nor the victimizer of the horrors of slavery are alive today. Tort reparation is simply unintelligible when dealing with the descendants of victims and victimizers rather than the victims and victimizers themselves. How do you even begin to justify the notion that it's ethical for an innocent person today to be culpable for the sins of their forefathers? Why are descendants entitled to damages for sins committed against their great-great-great-great-grandfathers? Why should an entire population pay for reparations when only a tiny fraction of the previous generation were guilty of owning slaves? Out of a population of millions, both in the UK and the States, only a few thousand were actual slave owners. Why should Irish, Italian, Slavs, and a whole host of other ethnicities pay for reparations when they themselves were often victims of social disenfranchisement? Do they get reparations now? And if so, from whom? So this is the problem when you try to apply tort law to situations and contexts that have nothing to do with actual reparation.
Then again, why is the demand for reparations always focused and framed in terms of Britain? Why are no activists asking for reparations from the African states that were equally complicit in slavery? Should they not pay reparations? They provided the slaves that were transferred over the ocean, and millions more slaves were kept in slavery in Africa by other Africans, just as were being transported across the Atlantic. Why does nobody ever actually speak about that unpleasant truth? What about the Arabs and the Muslims who bought and sold African slaves for centuries before the British arrived and continued to do so into the 20th century until the British and the French tried to stop it? And indeed, what about the slavery that carries on today? The International Labour Organization says that currently approximately 7 in every 1,000 Africans is a slave. 10 million people. In 2017, CNN reported hundreds of slaves are sold every week in Libya. So much energy is given to historic reparation and the historic plight of slaves. I would have more time for the argument if the people actively pursuing that course of action were equally vocal about surely the far more horrendous plight of slaves today, where there are more slaves today in bondage, in slavery, than crossed over the Atlantic. So where are the protests outside the Nigerian High Commission? Where are the protests outside the embassies of Niger, which has 800,000 slaves today? What about Mali and Chad and Sudan and Cameroon? It's almost as if there's an ulterior motivation behind the call for apologies and reparations exclusively from Britain.
Yes, and obviously what he's saying there about reparations in the UK equally applies to the pressures we have here in the States. Now, what this historian brought up there was the rather inconvenient fact of African participation and profit in the slave trade. Okay, things were not simply as clear-cut as reparations rhetoric would have us believe. It's been amply documented how Africans themselves profited off the slave trade, often in collaboration with local chiefs, and served as intermediaries with European and Arab purchasers. That fact alone should be enough to dispel any semblance of plausibility for reparations rhetoric. As you probably know, a number of financial experts are predicting that things are about to blow. The economy is sputtering out of control, and you need to prepare now for the economic catastrophe that may indeed be right around the corner. And all that means that there's simply never been a better time to protect your assets with the timeless value of gold and silver. And that is where our good friends over at Goldco come in. Click on that link below and learn the 3 simple steps you can take right now to protect your savings the way patriots throughout the centuries have always protected their assets, and that is with gold and silver. In fact, Goldco are patriots just like us. They want you to succeed so much, they're offering up to $10,000 in free silver while supply lasts. So don't wait. Click on that link below or visit my special website, turleytalkslikesgold.com.
But let's turn away from slavery and expand our view to colonialism more broadly. What disadvantage has colonialism actually caused to those living in the former British colonies of the Caribbean? And disadvantage compared to whom? And this is to go back to the point that you asked. Most of the former colonies of the Caribbean are now successful middle-income countries. The GDP per head of the Bahamas is higher than Portugal and is comparable to Spain and Italy. You never hear that, do you? Barbados, Antigua and Barbuda, St. Kitts and Nevis, and other former British slave colonies have higher rankings on the UN's Human Development Index than Brazil, Mexico, or many other Spanish-speaking South American countries. How has the British Empire disadvantaged the Caribbean nations? It's not clear to me. But let's test this further, and let's go and look and compare the nations of the Caribbean with modern West Africa, the original homelands of Caribbean slaves, to see what life is like there. GDP per capita in Benin is $1,430. In Barbados, it's $17,000, over 10 times higher. Life expectancy in Benin is 62, in Barbados it is 79. Rather than writing checks to well-off areas of the world, why not focus on countries and areas that are actually impoverished and require aid? Financial aid not attached to alleged attempts to cleanse one's soul. It can't be clearer. While slavery was abhorrent for those who were enslaved, had they stayed in Africa, the lives of their descendants today would be unquestionably worse. So what exactly actually is Britain being asked to pay reparations for? Because Britain wasn't the first empire in Africa, in India, in the Americas, but it was the most benign, and the benefits from it far exceed those, for example, of the Islamic and Indian empires that carved up India, of the Ashanti Empire, of the Dahomey Kingdom, and all of the hundreds and thousands of slaves that were ritually sacrificed every year in Benin. And the Benin Bronzes were mentioned. The Benin Bronzes commemorates those who actually owned slaves. So whilst on the one hand I can understand why you would protest Coulston's statue, why is there a celebration of the Benin Bronzes when they also commemorate slave owners? So why are we apologising for Britain? Are we apologising to Britain for introducing nutrition and food storage policies that led to a decline in the subcontinent's processes of famine that happened every 40 years? In India there was a famine. The population of India soared from 170 million to 450 million over the course of the Raj because of medicine, health, and accurate and proper nutritional standards and food storage compared to how it had been. There had never been in history of India such a surge in population growth. And let's not forget also what Britain did for women's rights, because I think it's fair to say that it's thanks to the British Empire that we have had the progression of women in Africa and India through society. Because, of course, India's history is one of female oppression. It was the British who abolished suti, the burning of widows on the funeral pyre of their husbands. It was the British that stopped the infanticide of young girls. And it was the British who allowed Hindu widows to remarry. I'm sorry if you don't like the facts, but facts are actually facts. Universities were brought into Africa and India by the British. It's quite... There will be no system of democratic legislatures within these regions. As Steven Pinker has written, pre-state societies before the British Empire arrived were on average far more violent than even the most brutal of modern states. So whilst many wrongs were committed in the 19th and 20th centuries, the modern success of Britain's former colonies today in the 21st century is due in large part to their colonial inheritance. The English language and the common law that enabled them to become global players, their civic institutions, the police, the military, the civil service, the judiciary, parliament, universities, every region of the world you go to, British colonies are the ones most likely to be the most developed, the wealthiest, and the most democratic.
Wow. I mean, talk about a tour de force over facts. What he said there was indisputable. For all the wrongs of colonialism, and we are certainly entering into a post-colonial world arising all around us, regardless, for all its wrongs, British colonialism imported a whole host of social and cultural practices that have clearly contributed to the former colonies' economic flourishing, from the establishment of private property rights, common law, to banking, to a flourishing university system, democracy. British colonialism did have a bright side to it. Again, the historical picture is nowhere near as clear-cut as reparations rhetoric would have us believe. So well done to this historian and the courage he has to stand up for truth in an otherwise very hostile and triggered environment. Hey gang, I know what it's like to feel alone out there in these turbulent times, but I broke free. If you too have been looking for a community with like-minded patriots who are serious about resisting globalism, building a parallel economy, and having intelligent and deep fellowship on a regular basis, then you've come to the right place. In my Courageous Patriot Insiders community, we're building a close-knit movement of, by, and for patriots who are breaking free from the outrage and despair cycles of the mainstream media and taking on the fight against globalism. Every week, I deep dive into the content I can't share on big tech and give you the cliff notes on the truth of how patriots just like you are building up their communities, starting patriot businesses, and fighting the woke in both public and private. All with a few history and political lessons from yours truly, of course. If you want to stop feeling alone as a patriot and stand together with this fast-growing community, be sure to click on the link in the description below. Don't wait. Join me and my Patriot Coalition today, and let's get fighting.